As thousands continue to protest at the Gaza-Israel border. Palestinians are demanding a right to return to the land they were forced to leave some 70 years ago when Israel was created, and an end to the blockade of the Gaza Strip, home to some 2 million people. Well, that story getting a lot of attention across the world.
Death and violence once again, unfortunately, came to the border between Gaza and Israel today.
Even from a couple of hundred meters away, we can hear the Palestinian chants of peaceful demonstration, and God is great.
Israel says it only targeted those trying to breach the border fence.
But it has gone mostly unnoticed here in the U.S. An op-ed in the LA Times gives one reason for what the author believes is a misrepresentation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, saying even if the facts are accurately stated, the ways in which sentences are constructed and the extent to which details are contextualized can subtly lead readers astray. After the first day of unrest, for example, the New York Times print edition led with the headline, "Confrontations with Gaza Fence Leave 15 People Dead." A rather ambiguous headline that obscures who did what to whom and why. Now try to find that same story online, and it now reads, Israeli military kills 15 Palestinians in confrontations at Gaza border. And while the U.S. president condemned the chemical attack in neighboring Syria, he hasn't said anything about the flare-up on the Israel-Gaza border. Now, Trump's Middle East envoy, however, released a statement that certainly seems to take a side, saying, "We condemn leaders and protesters who call for violence and who send protesters, including children, to the fence, knowing that they may be injured or killed. Instead, we call for a renewed focus by all parties on finding solutions to the dire humanitarian challenges facing Gazans." He made no mention, of course, of the use of live ammunition against unarmed civilians. Now, the U.S. flexing its muscle at the United Nations, blocking a vote reprimanding Israel's response to the violence in Gaza. Now, even after the death of a 30-year-old Palestinian journalist, Yasser Mortaja, the Washington Post humanizing the deceased newsman with a touching profile. Israel has faced international criticism over its use of live fire, though the military saying it doesn't intentionally target journalists. Those comments, though, seeming to negate earlier remarks made by Israel's defense minister, saying there are no naive people in the Gaza Strip. Everyone's connected to Hamas. Everyone gets a salary from Hamas. And all the activists trying to challenge us and breach the border are Hamas military wing activists. For more on the violence in Gaza, I'm now joined by Yousef Munayyer, Executive Director for the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and Robert Mahoney, Deputy Executive Director for the Committee to Protect Journalists. We reached out to several Israeli officials as well for this segment, but it's important to note they were unable to join us. Yousef, let me begin with you. I want to start with what is happening on the ground right now. Explain to us, as you understand it, what is happening inside Gaza along the Israeli-Gaza border.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. It's great to be with you. Actually, I think it's quite simple what's going on. You have a population in the Gaza Strip that is really sick and tired of the situation that they're facing on top of decades of occupation and first becoming refugees from towns and villages just outside of the Gaza Strip. They're also dealing with a very brutal and indiscriminate siege that is targeting over 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, denying them freedom of movement, denying them the basic rights and necessities, to the point where the United Nations has said that life in Gaza may not be sustainable by the year 2020. And so Palestinians have turned to these organized mass mobilizations to challenge this policy of engagement that the Israelis have placed on the Gaza Strip, not just demanding their right to return to villages, but their right to move freely in and out of Gaza and to other Palestinian areas as well, which is something that Israel indiscriminately denies to Palestinians in Gaza, with the most rare exceptions. And what we're seeing from the Israelis is a brutally repressive response of those protests. That is the situation in a nutshell.
Okay, Yousef. Rob, let me get your take on what has happened with this Palestinian journalist, because I want you to give us a quick sense of what the conditions are for Palestinian journalists working in Gaza. And more importantly, what do you make of the defense minister's statement that everyone in Gaza is affiliated by Hamas, paid for Hamas? Some may look at that and say that is an excuse by the Israeli military, which obviously considers Hamas as a terrorist organization, to consider everyone as a hostile threat.
Well, that's patently false. Journalists in Gaza are trying to work independently. They're not all in the pay of Hamas, and even if they are, it doesn't mean that they should be shot by Israeli army snipers. Journalists in Gaza are working under incredible pressure. They're unable to leave. The photographer who was killed has never left Gaza. He was 30 years old, even though he tried. And they are going up to the fence to photograph. He was wearing a clear press marker, and he was hit. We know that there are Israeli army snipers, some 100, who were sent there to prevent people approaching the fence. But reports say that this journalist was between 100 and 250 yards from the fence. So what threat was he posing to the security of Israeli forces?
There was some report that he was perhaps operating a drone. He certainly had a drone. He's used a drone in the past. Is that in and of itself considered by international standards and rules of engagement a threat to a military, that perhaps they thought that was a threat to them and they decided to engage him?
That's what the Israelis have said, but I mean, frankly, drones are now a common piece of equipment for
used
photographers
by journalists all around the world.
And he's been using that. And as I say again, he was clearly marked as a journalist. He's a civilian, therefore he was not posing a threat, as far as the reports that we have read, to anyone who was maybe 300, 400, 500 yards away from where he was shot.
Yousef, there's the accusation coming out of Israel is that many Palestinians have used protests like this in the past, particularly militant groups, to try and carry out attacks against Israel. And so I'm curious to also get, I want to read this statement from the Israeli ambassador to the UN, who put out a statement calling on the UN Security Council to condemn Hamas. It reads in part, the council must condemn Hamas for its exploitation of children as human shields, risking their lives, and must call for an end to the provocations that only increase violence and tensions. The riots of the past week have proven to be violent outbursts and not peaceful demonstrations. Is it your sense that Hamas is fueling these protests? Is it only them? Are there other Palestinian factions involved? What more can you tell us about who's behind these protests?
Yeah, there's a collection of groups that are involved in supporting these protests, and Hamas is not the only group involved. In fact, I think Hamas is probably threatened by the extent of the success and organization of protests, which have been very well organized, very well put on, and primarily put on, as I think the images that you will see from all of them, under a Palestinian national flag, not a flag bearing Hamas's factional symbol or the Fatah symbol or anything like that. So this is a pan-Palestinian event. All of the different factions there are supportive of these kinds of efforts, primarily because it represents the grievances of all Palestinians living in Gaza and all Palestinians who are refugees. And I would just add a note about the journalist who was killed. 7 Palestinian journalists were targeted by the Israelis yesterday. It was Yasser Murtaja who ended up dying from the gunshot wound, but many others were injured in what clearly seems like an intentional attempt to keep Palestinian journalists away from capturing these images and bringing them to the world to see.
Rob, very quickly, how would you rate the American media coverage of this particular flare-up in the conflict?
It's not been as extensive as it needs to be. This is a conflict which does get a lot of publicity when certain incidents take place, and one side is the target. Therefore, I think that the American media needs to take more notice, particularly of the killing of journalists who are the ones trying to bring us the photos.
Yeah, and as Yousef mentioned, there's been more than one that have been injured. Yousef Munayyer and Robert Mahoney, thank you both very much for joining us. That will do it for this week. Join me back here next